your bio in a couple minutes.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, John. And I'm very happy to be here, and it's great to see you again and reconnect. Yeah, the 2-minute elevator speech in terms of my background. The way that I often describe it is I've been at the intersection of education, technology, and project management for almost my entire career. I've done everything from being a classroom teacher, which is where I started my career as a 6th grade classroom teacher out in California. I've worked in the technology industry. I've worked for Apple on a couple of different occasions in the early 2000s. And then I left, and that's when I went overseas, and we'll talk about that. And then worked internationally for both the Western Academy of Beijing in a couple of different roles. So on that theme of being able to reinvent yourself, I had a couple of opportunities to do that there. And then moved on to the International School of Tanganyika, and then repatriated to the US about 7 years ago. And a lot of reinvention the last 7 years, I would say, as well. And again, the theme that I think the common thread through all of those experiences, again, is that intersection of education, technology, and project management, which definitely has helped set me up for the current role where I'm an IT project manager at the University of New Hampshire.
Fantastic. And Tom, so if you think of the different contexts that you've been, so as you shared, you've been international, you've been home side as the United States, where you're originally from, and you've kind of pivoted between both of those worlds. What are some learnings that you feel you've engaged with in one context that you brought over to the other, and vice versa? So you were in education, you're a classroom teacher, and then maybe I think you went to work with Apple and then came back to the Western Academy. I'm just curious, from the experiences and learnings you've had, what have you been able to bring to the corporate world, or what has the corporate world experience allowed you to bring to the school experience? Because so often people say there is no crossover, and I'm just curious what you think of that.
It's a great question. And, I think in my experience as a whole, I think teachers, educators tend to undersell themselves in terms of the skills that they have, that they could bring to a corporate environment. I think every teacher out there would be a good project manager. And I'm sincere about that, because a lot of the soft skills that a project manager requires to manage a project are very important. Teachers have those soft skills. So we're talking about the empathy. That's teachers. That's obviously a very solid skill that teachers have, and that's important. Managing projects is understanding what other people are working through in terms of their part of a project. I think the ability to, work collaboratively with others is a skill that all teachers have, that I think from a project manager perspective definitely would come into play. So yeah, I mean, I think in general, yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity if teachers want to try something outside of education to not undersell I think the skills that they've acquired in teaching.
Do you think, Tom, also it's maybe, so for example, let's just create a scenario. You are a teacher, you've a very good experience, you've had a lot of professional learning, and you decide to go into the non-education area. Do you think sometimes it's that the companies don't understand the skill set that the teacher's bringing, and where there's the disconnect? Or is it also maybe partly how we sell ourselves when we're in that context, which is very different from applying at a recruitment fair to a principal or a director, where you already have many commonalities?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think, like I said, I think teachers tend to undersell themselves a little bit in terms of the skills that they could bring to a company. But yeah, I do think, and I've seen this where, the company will kind of, well, they're just a teacher. And I don't mean that, I know it sounds awful to say, but I think that there is a bit of that attitude sometimes, and I think it's incorrect. I think teachers bring a lot of valuable skills to the work in corporations, and I've seen this, and I could give examples of when I worked for Apple the second time. The team that I was on was essentially a group of former educators, and so our role was to work with schools on using Apple technology in the classroom. And so, I mean, there definitely was that education as working directly with schools, and so certainly leveraging the strengths that all of us educators had. But then there's also, the corporate side and things of that nature that come into play, kind of the little things can come into play, changing from school to corporate. I mean, it's as silly as it sounds, just getting used to the calendar. And what I mean by that is that I remember taking my first job with Apple. It was like, I don't know, it was like February. And then when June rolled around, like, hey, your natural calendar said, shouldn't we be saying goodbye to people and see you like next fall? And that obviously didn't happen. So, adjusting to more like year-round work was a little bit of an adjustment.
But that's an interesting adjustment. And I think it's interesting. I've talked to other people that have been in education, and it's really been a challenge because they're used to, their life, their family life, their children. They've been used to kind of those, the February break, fall break, spring break, and long summers. And then suddenly they're given 4 weeks for the year, or in some scenarios in North America, I think it's even less. And that is also, I think, often a big transition, is where work is not funneled in tight spaces. In other words, you really power out for those 7-8 months, and then you get to kind of deconnect. Well, maybe in the corporate world, it's not that pace. The pacing is different. Would you talk to that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. Here it is, years later, being essentially on, even though I'm associated with the school, we're still very much on a corporate schedule. Yeah, I mean, when June rolls around and I'm on Facebook and I watch all the posts of friends going off to their summer breaks, I'm admittedly jealous. It's certainly wonderful to see, and I enjoy following the things that they do. But yeah, there's definitely those days when, it's like the middle of July and I'm having to go upstairs into my office at home or come into the office here, and I see pictures of people at the lake or wherever. Those days can be a little bit challenging to focus on work. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like a little thing, but it isn't an adjustment. And you brought up a point related to like family, right? Like if you have children, then you're going to be on the same schedule as your children, and there's certainly some advantages to that in terms of work. I suppose I'm making it sound like, hey, the corporate schedule is bad. It's not. I mean, the nice thing about it is that once you accrue those vacation days, then I can use them whenever I want. So, I've had some great opportunities to travel during those off-peak shoulder seasons when, things aren't crowded. And that's fantastic. I certainly love that. So you're not tied to certain periods of time for your break. You have that flexibility of taking them whenever. And that's an advantage for sure.
You were talking about, the soft skills, the empathy, the collaboration that educators bring to the table. as a very powerful skill set in the context of a corporate or non-education setting. What are some things that you worked for Pearson and then Apple too? What are some things that you learned in that context that you brought into the pedagogic world that maybe you were like, wow, that was a skill that maybe I would have never gotten if I hadn't had that experience, that you were able then to use in the education context?
So you're talking, wait, you're
Kind of
talking
the
like,
opposite. We were talking, what do teachers bring to the corporate world? What do your learnings from the corporate world brought into your education work?
oh, gotcha. Well, I definitely think strong project management skills, at least for me, has been something that I've brought into the education space. I've brought that to both work on the IT side and then also on the education side. So when I was in Tanzania, I had 3 roles. It was basically like secondary school, the way we were organized at the time. It was secondary school IT director / technology integrator / grade 10 technology teacher / head of the IT, the IT DT department. One of the things that I remember was bringing some agile project management methodologies to my grade 10 students. And so if you're not familiar with agile, it's a methodology in project management, which, like the name, it implies agility. And so being able to act on opportunities because of the way you structure the work. So without getting into the weeds of agile, it meant that, if my students were involved in creating an IT project, they were utilizing that agile approach. So with their groups, they would have what we call their daily stand up, where they would meet as a group. Okay, what did we do yesterday? What are we going to do today? Is there anything blocking us? And if there's something blocking us, then how do we resolve that? And they're repeating that on a daily basis, working toward, typically we'd set up our schedule so that by the end of the week, they had a deliverable of some kind that they'd made progress on, that then they could show to me, that they could show to others, and then improve on what they did. So it was definitely a different approach, and it was because of what I learned on the software development side in corporate. I was able to bring that into education. And anyone interested in learning more about that, if you actually just Google Agile in education, you'll come across a wealth of resources related to bringing that approach into the classroom. And I think it definitely has a lot of great applications for those of you who are IT, DT type teachers.
Excellent. Oh, that's so interesting to see that. And you hear a lot about that in the corporate non-education sphere. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think many schools have looked at the design thinking model as an example, and the one that, there's solution fluency, which is kind of a bit of a process, but I don't think has that agility tied to it.
Right. Yeah. If from a project management perspective, and I'm a little bit out of the game in terms of the IB, IT, DT classroom, but the approach has historically, from my observation, has been more what we call waterfall in terms of project management, meaning that you're coming up, here's what my goal is, here's my endpoint, and then how do I work backwards from that in that waterfall style approach. And so, yeah, I think, at least from my experience, I definitely think there's some advantages to bringing in some more agile approaches to it. And I definitely think the students learned quite a bit.
Yeah, I can only imagine. That's fantastic. So when you were in the non-education field and then decided to come back into education, what were some maybe things that you had to convince people? Hold on here. Because I've been in the corporate world, guess what? I'm an added value. I can bring that. Was there also some pushback maybe because you had been out of the education game?
Little bit. I definitely think it was an advantage. So let me give you a specific example. So when I went to the Western Academy of Beijing in 2006, I came straight from the corporate world. So I was with Apple the first time. I was with them from 2002 to 2006. And so I worked specifically with Power School, which now is kind of lost in tech lore, but once upon a time, Apple owned Power School, the student information system. And so I was brought over to the Western Academy to work on the implementation of Power School, which definitely had its ups and downs, and we can talk about that more if you'd like. But I do think, even though I came directly from that corporate environment, there was an advantage to be able to tell people that, hey, besides just having been with Apple, I also come from an education background. Prior to my work at Apple, I was a classroom teacher, just like all of you. Now, at that point, it was, it was on just the American public school system. It wasn't IB. So, I definitely drank from the fire hose. And I remember being in many a meeting trying to wrap my head around what is this IB stuff, because it was very different from what I had been used to in terms of the American system, and then trying to pop Power School, which is very much an American school system design, onto this very different IB system was a challenge, to be sure. So I guess to go back to your question, it was certainly very helpful to be able to speak generally about coming from an education background. It was the IB piece that was missing, but I learned that pretty quickly, to the point that when I did repatriate to the United States and I started going back to work in American public schools, I had to relearn that. in terms of how teachers approach things, and how it was very different from what I had been accustomed to at that point, the previous 8 years.
Yeah, that's just so interesting how, and that's maybe talks to something about this idea. You were talking about agile project learning, but also agility as a professional, as you navigate between different contexts, how you have to be able to adapt. And you have the anecdote of drinking from the fire hose of the IB. What are some things, if you had to give some advice? So we have a teacher or a leader that's deciding to navigate out of education into the corporate world and back and forth. What are some things that have really been very helpful for you as you've made that decision to move out and look for new professional opportunities, and then after a while come back in? What are some of the dispositions that you've really relied on that you think are things to explore if our listeners here are considering some of these opportunities?
I think that the big thing is just a positive can-do attitude. I think a sense of adventure is important. Like when we repatriated to the US in June of 2014, neither my wife nor I had jobs lined up. The only thing we had was I had some connections, some people who I knew who still worked for Pearson, who'd owned Power School at the time. So it was utilizing those connections to be able to parlay that into contract work. And so what contract work was essentially training in school districts, various Pearson projects or products rather. So I did some Power School training. So what that meant was they would send me to a school in Massachusetts or a school in Tennessee, and I would show up and I would train, with Power School, and then get paid for doing that. Same thing with another product that I learned during that time, which was called SchoolNet, which is essentially like a testing software. It allowed educators to put together tests just to see where students were with reading, math, science, that kind of thing. I think, again, a positive can-do attitude, a sense of adventure. I think you definitely have to be comfortable with ambiguity. we discussed before, working for a school, the year is set, a lot of the structure is set and things like that. Kind of leaving that structure creates its own ambiguity, I think, and being comfortable with that is an important skill. And then something else that I'd mentioned, network. So if there's people that who can help you, definitely reach out to those people. Once we made the decision to repatriate, my recruiting looked very different than what it looked like internationally, right? With international, at least at the time that I was in the game, it was like musical chairs. You all stand up at one point and you shuffle around, and hopefully you land in a chair that you like.
That's a great analogy. I like that.
Yeah, and so repatriating and going back to going into the corporate world, it looks very different. So you have to create your own experience for that. So again, what that meant to me is every person who I knew who could be a possible link to a job, I was talking to them. I was spending late nights on, at the time it was Skype, just talking to people saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm coming back. This is what I'm looking for. And they might not have something for you, but usually it leads to someone who can help you. And
so what I'm hearing, and this is really interesting, Tom, is that your professional learning network was so important. So you had curated and built a professional learning network through your contacts at Apple, Pearson, and the school districts, and of course at WAB and IST. And that's what you leveraged as your recruitment tool, is basically having those conversations. And even though you say, for example, you reached out to me and I wouldn't have anything, but I'd be like, oh, you should talk to this person. And I think that is something that, educators, our professional learning network, especially if we're in the international school context, tends to be very insular in the sense we know this principal, a friend is working there, and we use those contacts, and that's usually how you hear about a job, or you get ahead of the game because you worked with a principal, or a principal knows you're a principal. Would you say that was very similar when you went back to the United States?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I was lucky in that I still had connections from when I worked for Apple the first time. And, other folks might not have those connections, but I think, if you dig deep enough, if you go through the connections that you do have, oftentimes you can find someone who knows someone who knows someone who can provide that introduction and that opportunity to do something outside the education space. So I think it's absolutely, it's real currency. And so, you leveraging that into something tangible is an important skill. It actually led to me coming back to Apple the second time. And what happened was, like I described, I was doing contract training for Pearson with those two products I mentioned. And the person who was responsible for the contract trainers, he just wanted to come check out what I was doing, just see how things were going. So he observed me when I was doing one of my trainings, and we went out to dinner that evening, and we were just chit-chatting. And it turned out that we had someone in common that we knew who was back at Apple. And so he made that reintroduction to me to this person, which then led to a conversation, which led to coming back to Apple the second time. And so,
fascinating.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's definitely something I learned over the years that I worked internationally, and you certainly described it, and something that I learned in the corporate world. Anytime you meet somebody, what I learned is kind of imagine that in 2 or 3 years, you might be asking them for help with a job search. I think back to people that I've met that literally that happened, where I've met them, and 2 or 3 years later, I was on the other side of the interview table, so to speak. So what I'm getting at is when you meet someone, don't dismiss them.
Yeah, and I think that that's so important. What you're saying is that every conversation, especially in a semi-professional context, be it you go out to dinner after a workshop, or you're at a conference, or you meet somebody in the same industry, is really, I'm hearing, is leverage that, be respectful, be empathetic, but also really give the time, because you're basically investing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You're investing in yourself later. You never know when you might be able to leverage something that the person that you've just met might be able to bring to you. And so yeah, it
Did
doesn't
you did you leverage LinkedIn?
um at the time, no, I didn't. But I definitely use it a lot more now than I have in the past. Yeah, I post a bit more. I go on it a bit more to see what people are doing. I definitely have been spending more time there the last year or so, especially.
And why have you been focusing more on that than the other way you did it, which was more informal through Skype and your contacts?
Well, I think because it's a real tool, and you have a lot of those things in one place now with LinkedIn, whereas before it was all over the place. Hey, I got to go back to this email that I had from this person, this conversation a few years ago, or maybe a chat on Skype or something like that. So it was kind of scattered. With this, I have the ability to do the same thing, but in one place.
Yeah, yeah.
I really like that.
Tom, so you moved in and out of the United States a few times, and maybe talk to us a bit about the learning that happened with that, coming back and leaving, and now you're back again.
Yeah. So I left the U.S. to work overseas in 2006, and that's when I left Apple to go work for Western Academy, and I didn't know what to expect. It was a hard decision. I really struggled with it because I really liked what I was doing with Apple. I really liked being a part of Apple. It was a very exciting time to be a part of Apple because that was our renaissance. Those of you really in the know with tech history know what I'm talking about. If you don't, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy, several years prior. The iPod is the device that really kind of brought Apple back from that brink. And so, I was everybody's best friend at Christmas time because discount that I got. So it was a hard decision, but I tend to have a bit of a sense of adventure. So I wanted to try something different. It was a calculated risk to the point that I negotiated, rather than your traditional 2-year contract, I negotiated a 1-year contract, and luckily I was able to do that, and that certainly made it a little bit easier because, again, not knowing what to expect. But wow, am I glad that I did that. I loved my time there. That 1-year adventure that I was expecting to be 1 year turned into 6 years. I have amazing memories of being in Beijing at also a very exciting time, the Olympics in 2008, for example, all the excitement around that. I met my wife there, which is obviously fantastic. So, it was just such a great experience work-wise, adventure-wise, the opportunities to travel and things like that. Meeting friends who are friends for the rest of my life. We're scattered around the globe like all expats are. We can go long periods of time without a conversation, but then just pick it right back up. And I think that's one of the really great features about international. And in terms of going back, I look back very fondly on our first year, especially back. To me, it was every bit as fun as going to a new international destination. There was the reverse culture shock was fascinating to me.
Did you treat it, Tom, as if you were coming to a foreign country? So you decided with your wife, we're going to repatriate to the United States, your home country. And did you say, okay, I'm going to take this as if I'm going to a country I don't know? Was there a bit of that in your head? Because you talked about the reverse culture shock.
Yeah, I definitely did. And for me, it was a little bit different than my wife, because when we repatriated, so I'm from California, she's from New Hampshire, we met in Beijing, China. When we decided to repatriate, we went to New Hampshire, her home state. Definitely the best argument I've ever lost. It was a great decision to relocate to New Hampshire. So that the point that I'm getting at, it was definitely new to me living in New England. You know, there's still obviously, it's still obviously in the United States, so you know, part of my home country, but still quite a bit different than California. And certainly, you know, new scenery to take in and things like that. But yeah, I definitely did view it as you know, the next adventure, and tried to you know, have that same attitude, and you know, wanting to explore and take advantage of what's in the area, like I think we do when we go to a new international location. But yeah, you know, again, I look back very fondly on that, especially the first year with the reverse culture shock.
Talk to us a bit about the reverse culture shock. What was the reverse culture shock? Just maybe have an anecdote.
Let's see. You know, it starts to like the specific memories kind of have faded, but I do remember the feeling specifically. I mean, part of it is just being able to, or being able to go to like Target or the grocery store, and just how much stuff there is. And you know, sometimes you just get overwhelmed. Like I remember specifically being in the one of the aisles of the grocery store, and like how many things of ketchup could one possibly need, different varieties and things like that. It can be a little bit overwhelming. You know, some little things, like especially like from China, you know, like in China, if there's a little bit of space in the lot, you're queued up for a coffee. If you know, there's a little bit of space between you and the person in front of you, then that's open space for someone to jump the queue, so to speak. You know, here, not so much. You can have your, you know, kind of normal distance, or you know, American distance, I should say, not normal.
Yeah.
Little adjustments like that. Like, wow, I don't have to be right behind the person in front of me.
And it's interesting how sometimes you don't notice it till you leave the place and have a different context to refer to it. You know, I think sometimes that very likely you never thought of the distance in an American queue was such, and you had to go to China to really understand it better when you came back.
Exactly. And you know, now I think all of us are kind of relearning the space in the queue with social distancing and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's little things like that I would catch myself, and it was such a delight to go, wow, I'm in my home country, but it feels like a foreign country.
Yeah, and I think that's often some of the challenges that many of our colleagues that decide to come back or retire or come back to their home country and work in the context of their education system, you often hear that reverse culture shock, and that it takes time, almost as much as if you go to a foreign country, but there you almost expect everything to be culture shock.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think when you come back to your country, you anticipate you're more familiar with it, and then suddenly you realize there are some disconnects more than maybe you anticipated.
Yeah. And you know, even though it's been more than a few years that we've been home in the States, we still feel very much like we're international. You know, it's one of those things where once you experience it, it stays with you. I think you know, the mindset, the attitude, you know, that to be honest, it's still one of the challenges. You know, sometimes we sometimes don't feel like we've necessarily fit in. And you can't, it's more challenging to have some of the conversations that are just kind of part and parcel with being an international educator. It's just like, for example, you, as an international educator, you're talking about your work with students from everywhere and your colleagues who are from everywhere. And then, like, going back to the idea of the summer break, everyone would kind of disperse, and they would sometimes go back to their home country, oftentimes travel to different locations, going to conferences and definitely very different, amazing places. It's just part of the work and part of the lifestyle that goes with it. And here in the States, people tend to travel less, right? And so you sound like that person when you're talking about, oh, the time that I went to this this conference in Johannesburg or in Lisbon and things like that. It's just not the same experience that typical American educators have. They just don't tend to travel quite as much. So I find that sometimes you have to be careful to not come across again as that person.
You almost have to do some self-censorship.
Yeah, you do, because I think it was just like talking about it when we were overseas is just what we did, and it's what other people did, so it was the conversation. But
people were not fazed that you went to Bali for a conference.
Yeah, exactly. And so here, you don't want to come across like you're bragging.
Yes,
in my mind. So we that's one of the things that we tend to kind of tone down. I think the talk about some of the things that we've done, but we know all the great opportunities and experiences that we've had. So it's just fun to remember them.
And what's interesting is that you're saying they're still part of your dispositions and kind of your attitude. So they've really kind of almost become a part of the person that you are, even though you're now in a American-centric context. Those things haven't left. They've kind of had an impact on the way you look at the world.
Yeah. I know this might not be popular with some Americans, but I definitely think of myself internationally a lot more than I do actually American. I mean, there's definitely great things about where we live in particular, in the country in general. But I like I said, I don't think it ever leaves you, and the attitude and the mindset. So again, yeah, we feel we are internationalists living in America.
Yeah, how interesting. Now, Tom, this has just been wonderful to hear those perspectives as you navigate between different cultures and different jobs. If somebody is thinking about coming back to the United States or their home country from abroad, are there some things that you would want them to be mindful of, like to prepare? Now, one thing that you talked about was, if you came back without a job, but you really leveraged your professional learning network, you reached out to your different contacts and really were quite proactive and almost made it like a job. It was part of your recruitment strategy, was to really leverage those contacts. And what about, say, are there other things that you would say to people? Well, if you're going to come back to your home country, be mindful of a few things. What are some things that maybe you feel would serve other people well that you experienced?
The first thing that comes to mind, and it's something I've thought about quite a bit, is that things just have a way of working out. I think it doesn't mean that you don't need to have a strategy. I'm not suggesting that at all, but I definitely think, again, that positive can-do attitude, the sense of adventure, utilizing as many connections as you can in your network is helpful. Definitely, having a look at, your CV and matching that to whatever job it is that you're applying to is important, I think, in any context, really. But I think the big thing is that from my own experience, from watching the experience of others that I've seen on Facebook lately, people who've repatriated, things seem to have a way of working out. You might end up doing something very different than what you're currently doing or what you thought you might do. But again, I just strongly believe things have a way of working out, even though, you know, there could be some challenges. I remember some periods of time when money got pretty tight. You know, again, they seem to work out.
It's kind of having that positive attitude and positive intent as you engage with these changes, and knowing that, you know, putting time and thought really pays off.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah. Tom, this has been really such a wonderful opportunity to catch up with you and also hear about your adventure. You now are working in a university context and doing IT project management. What are you taking from all these experiences? What are, you know, you have a bag of tricks that you obviously are tapping into. Maybe describe a couple things that surprise you, that you went in there and you're like, oh, never thought of using that, but I'm going to. I'm putting you on the spot here, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. You know, I'm still getting my legs underneath me here with this particular role. I think this is the beginning of my 5th or 6th week. I think, I guess I'll take it back to networking. I guess that'll be maybe the theme of this particular conversation. I was just prior to this call, I was having a conversation with my manager, and one of my goals for the year is, we're calling it Know People. And the concept is around just getting to know people around the university who could help me do my work. You know, so, you know, for example, communication for a project manager is very important. We want to make sure that the people out there who a project affects, they have the right information at the right time. We don't want anybody to be surprised. So who are the people out there that can help me make sure that if there's an IT project that is going to impact various groups, you know, say a server upgrade or something of that kind that might result in some downtime, making sure no one's surprised. So who are the people who I can leverage to help me get the word out that, hey, this is what's going to happen, so we're not having anyone be surprised with certain services not working at certain times. So, you know, I get in my work, whether it's international, whether it's been international education or corporate work, the theme that the word that I've gravitated on, and the theme that goes with that, is intrapreneurial. And so what that means is that you're acting as an entrepreneur within the context of the organization. And so, you know, a good entrepreneur is out there networking with people. And, you know, again, the success, the way that I see the success of this job is to network with people within the university system, so I can leverage their assistance and support during certain times of a project. I guess it was a long answer to the short question.
No, but that's so it's the idea of the interpreneurial, where you're actually networking and doing your LinkedIn, but within the context of the work environment that you have, and having those conversations, or walking over to somebody in an office and saying, hey, let me tell you, know, I'm new, I want to hear about what you're doing. Or I can't agree with you more, is that so often, and you having been an IT director, you know, that is that most things only happen on the capacity that you've developed relationships to be able to leverage that relationship. Not that you want everything only on relationships, you want it on systems too, but those relationships are really important to allow you to explain or really garner support for your idea.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, relationship building is an important soft skill, I think, for project managers of any variety. And then again, I think, you know, cultivating relationships is an important aspect of international education. And then again, repatriating. So, you know I've talked about that a lot, and I must sound like I'm the most extroverted person out there. I'm not. I'm one of the more introverted people, but I understand that it's important to be able to, you know, network with people, have those conversations like you described, and build those relationships.
And that's what teachers do so well with their students every day, the idea of empathy and really, you know, being adaptable to the different needs and differentiated learning and all these things. as you said at the beginning of this podcast, are so important that you can bring into this context of now being managing IT projects at a big university. University of New Hampshire has many campuses. It's a large institution, and it's just so rich to hear that, yes, those classroom skills, those soft skills that you've developed are actually today being used. They're kind of the thing that you're pulling out of your bag of tricks, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience and wisdom. And I think, one thing that I'm walking away is just understanding the importance of networking and leveraging those conversations and never taking for granted any conversation or any off the cuff, maybe drink or maybe even a meal with somebody that you're working with or that you have a connection with.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just to reiterate that point, yeah, a specific example, I remember being across the interview table from someone who said, "Hey, I met you 2 years ago," and I had no recollection of that meeting, and I kind of had to fake my way through that. I ended up getting the job, but yeah, to the point, never, I'll pay attention to when you meet someone, because you never know what might result later on.
Absolutely. And on those wonderful words, thank you, Tom, for joining us at the International School Podcast. Just to remember the show notes, Tom has been really generous and shared his bio and also his LinkedIn and also a photography site that he's involved with. So make sure that you check the show notes, and you can find Tom on LinkedIn, of course. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next conversation.